Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel and to part 3 of my grand tour of the Booker Prize longlist. I've got 4 more books to talk to you about today, and I don't want to jinx it, but it is looking pretty good for me to finish the entire longlist with no DNFs, which for a slow reader like me is a pretty humongous achievement. It is going to go down to the wire though, so I think my final reviews of the last 3 books are going to have to come after my rankings and shortlist predictions, which I'm going to aim to get out just before the shortlist announcement. Let's not tarry though, because I've still got quite a bit of reading to do, and the sooner I get this video filmed, edited and published, the sooner I can get back to a spell of good things. Let's get into it. Okay, first up is Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. This is the second novel from the Canadian author, and this book is about a woman, she's the youngest of many siblings apparently, who travels to an unnamed country in order to look after her brother whose wife and child have recently left him. She throws herself into domestic pursuits, making herself small and passive and obedient, feeding her brother, washing him, which is kind of weird, and cleaning his house. She's confined to those tasks, seems content in being so, and she doesn't really speak the language of the country she's living in, and so isn't really equipped to broaden herself and go further than those domestic chores. Strange things begin to happen in the village that she's living in, particularly related to animals. So like a sheep has a stillborn calf and she comes across that sheep and I think it's stuck in a fence. There's a dog that has a phantom pregnancy. Cows lose their mind and then have to be culled. And as this has all started since our narrator arrived in the village, she's kind of held culpable by the villagers and they treat her with suspicion and contempt. But despite that, when her brother goes away for business, she tries to get a little bit more involved. She signs up to volunteer in the community and ends up mucking out the cowshed time and time again. Not sure why when the cows have been culled, but I'm sure there's some hidden meaning there. But over the course of her brother's absence, her passivity, her work, evolves into something more powerful, it seems. It's quite important, I think, to acknowledge that the protagonist is Jewish, and although we don't know exactly where this is set, her experience is very heavily contextualised by the displacement of Jewish people and their return to lands across Europe in World War II. This definitely seems like a place that she has roots to, but is not necessarily wanted. Now, if I've made that sound like this is some enticing mystery with a clear plot that gets resolved, then I am 100% mis-selling this book. This is a novel of ideas, and while it's short, it's one that really demands your time and attention. There are some super interesting ideas here, I think, about otherness, about conditioning of women to make themselves smaller and subservient, but I had no idea what was going on most of the time, and particularly at the end. Sadly, the book just didn't work for me. There are some beautifully constructed sentences all over the pages of this book, but a lot of the meaning just went over my head. You have to read closely, and I'm conscious that maybe I didn't read closely enough. And I worry a little bit that I'm maybe not a widely enough read person to get the most out of this book. There are a bunch of references at the back which aren't like footnotes throughout the text or anything. They're just like things that have inspired the writing that she's referring to, and I think she's clearly a very clever person, but maybe a little bit too clever for me. I think it would be really interesting to read like an annotated version of this where it unpicks some of the meaning and the subtext. And who knows, if this is shortlisted, I might give it a bit of a reread, because I did read it in a rush and I think I could give it a little bit more time to breathe. Maybe a second reading, I wouldn't go in expecting quite so much in terms of plot and denouement. So yeah, I didn't love it. I'm not going to dwell on that, and your mileage may vary. Okay, the next book I read was The House of Doors by Twan. Tan is an author that is well known to the Booker Prizes. His previous 2 novels, The Garden of Evening Mists and The Gift of Rain, have been respectively shortlisted and longlisted for previous Booker Prizes. I think it was that way around. And he was a judge in this year's motherhood-heavy international Booker. Interestingly though, despite that, this is one of the few books on this long list that is not concerned with motherhood. And in a way, that felt like a breath of fresh air. This is his 3rd novel and makes it 3 for 3 when it comes to taking a swing and connecting with a Booker judging panel. This one is about an encounter between the real-life novelist and short story writer W. Somerset Maugham, or Willie as he's referred to here, and the fictional little Leslie Hamlin when Willie comes to stay with Leslie and her husband in Penang, Malaysia. What Twan has done here is basically backwards engineer a story based on one of Morm's own short stories, The Letter, which is about the real-life trial of Ethel Proudlock, accused of murder. That trial and the events leading up to it, including the murder, also feature here. I enjoyed this book a lot, but I do feel a little conflicted about it. On the plus side, I think this book is expertly crafted and the pacing is an absolute joy. There are many layers of story going on and I felt really engaged by all of them. There's the present day of the novel where Leslie receives a mysterious package. There's the friendship that develops nearly 3 decades earlier between Willie and Leslie. And then there is Leslie's telling of both her own story and of Ethel's to Willie. It was all really, really well done, beautifully constructed, and the payoffs to all of these plots feel really satisfying and very well earned. The writing is lovely, brilliant craft. It's not necessarily the kind of writing that I'd say is my favourite, which would be a little bit more biting, a little bit more modern, but it really is top notch. It's a bit like pot noodles aren't my favourite food, but if I'm going to have one, then chicken and mushroom is the best. This book is the chicken and mushroom pot noodle. That's actually a terrible analogy because this book is not junk food. Just imagine like really, really good historical fiction writing, and it's probably this. However, I do have a few reservations. This is a book largely set in the early 1920s in a British colonial outpost. There are, of course, some dodgy views held by the characters, entirely true to what would have been prevailing at the time. But those views to me felt almost entirely unchallenged, unexamined. They never really came under the microscope. Nobody's worldview was particularly changed, despite friendships and more emerging across the boundaries of this prejudice. I felt really kind of confused by the way that Leslie simultaneously was dismissive and judgmental of local people while also supporting them. I have also seen some criticism of this book that it centres the white characters, and I do get that. As Western readers, I think we're quite acutely aware of the historical amplification of white and colonial voices and minimising or silencing the voices of people of colour or Indigenous peoples. But at the same time, I do think Twan is a Malaysian author and this is the story he's chosen to tell about Malaysia. I wonder a bit if this doesn't feel particularly controversial to him because he's living and writing in Malaysia, which is somewhere where he's not underrepresented. Ultimately, this is the story he's chosen to tell and I have to respect that. In any case, I do kind of wish the homophobia and racism was challenged a little bit more directly, that someone had their views changed. But yeah, other than that, I really enjoyed this one. I think it's beautifully written. I think if you like historical fiction, you'll have a wonderful time with it. And I think the House of Doors itself, when you find out what that is quite a magical image. And I look forward to inevitably seeing this in some adaptation on screen. I think it'll be a real corker. The third book I want to talk to you about is The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. This is the second book by this Irish novelist to be nominated for the Booker Prize following his previous shortlisting for Skippy Dies. Like Skippy Dies, this is a chunkster. Far and away the longest book on the long list this year, because although In Ascension has a page count that's not too far off, it's actually a much shorter book due to like font size and spacing and stuff. The Bee Sting is a legit beast. It's the story of the Barnes family, who are an Irish family that live a few hours from Dublin. It takes place shortly after the 2008 financial crisis, at a time of great change and turmoil for, I guess, wider Ireland, but also particularly for the family. We meet Cass, who's the teenage daughter of the family, about to take her final exams before heading off to university. PJ, her younger brother, who's terrified of being sent away to boarding school. Imelda is their mother, and she's worrying about the family's finances but really having very little control over them. And Dickie is the father who runs the family's car dealership, which is struggling, but he's pretty preoccupied and not really doing much about it. At first, we spend quite a long time with each of these characters in turn. There's almost like a novella that covers each character's perspective, and then about 2/3 in, the novel changes and moves into these shorter chapters that jump between the different characters' points of view. Each character, in my opinion, was really brilliantly drawn, very sympathetically and believably written. These felt like real people to me. I think part of what helped with this was that I listened to the audiobook, which I don't do too often, but it was just exceptionally well read by the cast. Each character has their own narrator and their performances are just completely engrossing. If you like a big family drama, then this book is absolutely for you. I loved spending so much time with these characters, flaws and all, and I found each of them rendered just so distinctively with humour and warmth, and just something that I can't put my finger on that made them come alive on the page, or I guess in my ear. Just to be super clear though, that might make you think that you're gonna get the fuzzies while you're reading this. You are not. This is not a happy book, and it is laden with trauma and fear that is both personal and existential. I have seen something said by Paul Murray about this being a climate change book, and while I don't think that is really a dominant plot point throughout the novel, it definitely is a theme that is hinted to on a number of occasions. But despite that sadness, I think Paul Murray strikes a really great balance between this darkness and dark comedy. There are many, many secrets, small and large, that are revealed over the course of this novel. Not always to the other characters, but definitely to us as readers. Some of this plays out in the present day of the novel, but we also find things out, very shocking things, as the older characters look back on their pasts. And I found that done absolutely expertly. I was frequently wrong-footed, thinking I'd worked out this secret or that, only to be walloped in the ears because it was on audio by the true revelation. Or in some cases I was double bluffed, and when I just discounted the theory that I had, there it was again. Like I say, this is not a happy book, but it is warm. It's very generous to its characters. It puts them through the ringer, but it sees things from their perspectives really thoughtfully. It accounts for the motivations of their actions without judgment. And the ending, oh lordy, the ending. I kind of want to say it's spectacular, but I think it's gonna divide people. You are either going to be completely infuriated by it, or you are going to drop to your knees and declare Paul Murray a genius. I'm leaning towards donning the knee pads and saying Murray's a genius. But whatever you think of it, as you approach those final pages and work through them, you are going to have your heart in your throat as you read them. This book comes highly, highly recommended from me, and I definitely would say the audiobook is worth it. I think this is a big contender. Okay, the final book that I'm going to tell you about today is In Ascension by Martin MacInnes. MacInnes is a Scottish author, and this is his third novel, but his first Booker nomination. The nomination is super interesting in that it marks the rare appearance of a sci-fi novel on the list, and it is fairly heavy on the sci, which was something that absolutely worked for me, but it may be too much technical jargon for some other readers. This is the story of a Dutch microbiologist called Lee, and it's split into 5 sections that basically chart journeys that she goes on over the course of her life and career. It's hard to talk about much of this book without spoilers, so I'm going to try and avoid anything too explicitly spoilery and keep it a little bit vague where I can. Basically, Lee goes on a voyage to a previously undetected undersea vent and has this really interesting experience as part of that trip. She then comes back and gets involved with this international organisation which is a little bit shadowy but wishes to fund her research. This research takes what was found at the deepest depths of the ocean and connects it up to the furthest reaches of space. In many ways, I found this a really interesting sibling piece to Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary. It feels like the much more serious literary brother to that book. By literary, I mean more in terms of like style and ambitions and what it's trying to say, rather than in any like normative or judgmental sense. Because while Project Hail Mary is a pacey sci-fi thriller that thrives on the action of connection and the puzzle of its plot, In Ascension instead is focused on rumination about what connection is, and its plot unfolds quite linearly. Both books contain many scenes of selectively breeding microorganisms, which if you enjoyed in one, I think you'll enjoy in the other. Personally, I love seeing that stuff. The nematode breeding of Brandon Taylor's Real Life was a real highlight of that book for me, so maybe I'm just a loser. And they also kind of suffer from some of the same problems. So In Ascension does something that Weir's writing also does, more so in The Martian than in Project Hail Mary, but it just has dialogue that is so full of exposition. Characters explain things to each other that they wouldn't believably have to in like real scientific settings. And this is for the sake of the reader. I get why, but it is a little bit jarring. The writing in general, though, is really nice. It frequently grasps for wonder, it makes you feel small, and it's mostly really successful. There were a few lines that I had to read 3 or 4 times, which just didn't make any sense to me. But other than that, I could tell what was going on and picture everything pretty clearly, which is quite a big ask actually of a lot of sci-fi, because we're asked to step into these odd concepts and situations that we would never really see and picture them. One thing I absolutely loved was how much this book was preoccupied with life and evolution, one thing begetting another, the circularity and interconnectedness of all things at all scales. It's a running theme that permeates the form, the plot, even mysterious objects that have these fractal circular patterns on their surface. It's big brain thinking that never muddies what you're reading in the moment of the novel, but if you scratch under the surface, if you read between the lines, it's always there. I think the book makes one particularly bold choice towards the end, where the perspective changes and we're taken away from this really, I guess, crucial moment of action and mystery. And I was put off a little bit at first. It made me worry about how the book could possibly wrap up its story in a satisfying way. Luckily for me, the ending completely did work. I found it a really satisfying way to pull together some of the plot threads, and it kind of made me say wow, because I loved what it was trying to do and what it was trying to say without being super explicit about it. You do need to give it a little bit of thought, and then it becomes clear what the implications of what you've been reading are. You will notice that I only say some of the plot threads, and that's because a lot is left dangling. I'm sure this was done to leave plenty of room for imagination, and that's fine, but I do find that without much online discussion or speculation about the events of the novel, which you get a lot for TV shows with a lot of lore or video games, you just don't get that for novels in quite the same way unless they're part of a blockbuster series. And so I'm kind of left wanting to find out more, but I don't have the collective wisdom of a fandom to lean on to say whether I'm right or to discuss competing theories. And that unfortunately leaves me wondering whether MacInnes knew what was going on himself, or whether it was just an underbaked plot. Overall, I really did enjoy this one. I don't think I loved it quite as much as I wanted to. I was half expecting it to become an all-time favourite, which is probably an unfair amount of pressure, but I had a great time with it, and it definitely got me thinking. I think if you are in any way inclined to sci-fi, or you are happy with a little bit of laboratory-based prose, then you'll enjoy it too. That's a wrap on part 3 of my Booker Prize journey. I've got 3 more books to review for you. One I've already read and actually previously reviewed in a monthly wrap-up, and then 2 more that I'm currently reading. One on audio, How to Build a Boat, and one which I'm reading on Kindle, which is A Spell of Good Things. Hoping to get both of those finished in time for that very exciting shortlist reveal on the 21st of September. I would love to hear if you've read any of the books that I talked about in today's video. Did you love them? Did they work for you? What didn't work for you? Let's have a chat in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up. Really helps my channel out. And if you're not subscribed and you want to see more of my content, then hit the subscribe button and a new video will land in your feeds once a week or thereabouts. But until next time, toodles.